right. Hello again, everyone. We just had a good lecture with Nikolai Kozhanov, Galip, on how the Middle East looks at Russia. So that's what the fellows heard about for the previous hour. I'm happy to see you all again. We will be engaging in a slightly different format now. It's actually a first for me to do something like this, but I will engage in a conversation with our guest, Galip Dalay, who I'll introduce in a second, where we'll look in depth at a particular relationship in the Middle East region, which is the Russian-Turkish relationship, though we could have a long debate about whether Turkey should be counted as being part of the Middle East. I think it doesn't count itself as being part of the Middle East. Perhaps Galip can say a few words about that, but we will look in depth at this relationship because it's a quite interesting one with far-reaching implications that reach much beyond the Middle East. I mean, I would say already before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, the Russian-Turkish relationship and its trajectory, its manifestations had caused quite a bit of headache in Western capitals, especially in Washington, with Turkey buying the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, working together with Russia in various conflict theaters, which we will address in this conversation, from northeast Syria and northwest Syria via Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think there was certainly a perception in the West that Turkey, which is a NATO ally at the end of the day, and which hosts US nuclear weapons at its base in Incirlik, had developed quite a good relationship with Russia in previous years, and that was a cause for concern. And then since February, Turkey has, I would say, tried very hard to walk a fine balancing act between Russia on the one hand, with which Turkey has important relations, and the West and Ukraine. To just, give a few bullet points on that balancing act, I believe Turkey has not joined any sanctions against Russia. It's continued to purchase Russian gas. Some worry that Turkey might provide a permissive environment for Russian oligarchs who look to park their money and their assets abroad. But on the other hand, Turkey has also provided Bayraktar drones to Ukraine, which have been not insignificant on the battlefield. Turkey has invoked the Montreux Convention, which regulates the passage of warships through the straits. At some point, Turkey closed its airspace for Russian aviation bound towards Syria. And perhaps most importantly, and I think Galip will go into this, Erdogan has offered himself as a mediator in the Ukraine war more broadly from the beginning, as have the Israelis, but I think the Israelis have done it to a less successful extent. The Turks have been more active. But also regarding the grain export specifically, I believe that the Turks continue their negotiations with various sides to try to get a deal on this issue. So there's really a lot going on. And I haven't even mentioned Turkey's leverage play right now to use this situation where it is an important mediator to extract certain concessions from NATO aspirants, Finland and Sweden, who seek to join NATO. There's stuff going on with Turkey and Greece. Turkey might be preparing for a new military operation in Syria, calculating that the West is distracted by Ukraine. There's so much going on in this relationship. And we want to have a conversation about this and ask, what explains the nature of the Russian-Turkish relationship? What are the interests on both sides? What are the main drivers? To what extent are those drivers institutional? To what extent are they personal? Is this largely a story about Putin and Erdogan getting along? Or has this relationship deeper roots on both sides? To what extent is it ideological versus pragmatic? Is it largely driven by pragmatic economic interests? Or is there a certain convergence in a specific type of anti-Westernism on the Russian and Turkish side? And if that is the case, how would we define that anti-Westernism? And that will hopefully allow us to then ask the question, is this relationship sustainable, or is it bound to change with leadership changes, whether that's in Turkey or Russia or other events? So, and we want to look at these questions both from the Russian and the Turkish perspective, hopefully, before moving into Q&A. So that's basically the plan for the next hour or so. And I'm very pleased to have my friend and colleague and interlocutor for many years, Galip Dalay, join me to try to do this. Galip Dalay is a fellow at SWP, which is the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He's also a doctoral researcher in the history faculty at Oxford University. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House, a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. And his research focuses, of course, on Turkish foreign policy, but also questions of regionalism, regional order, and governance in the Middle East politics more broadly, Turkish-Russian relations, which is what we'll talk about today, and also the history and politics of Turkish-Western European relations, among other issues. And he's a frequent writer. His pieces have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, Project Syndicate, CNN. I think, Galip, you wrote something on sort of Erdogan's mediation in the Ukraine war on CNN just a few weeks ago. The National Interest, Newsweek, Le Monde. Okay, I could enlist more publications, but I'll stop here. You have the bio on the website as well. So welcome, Galip, into this conversation today. So perhaps let's start this with interests. And if I was asked to summarize Russian interests vis-a-vis Turkey today or in recent years, I guess I would sort of broadly categorize it into political security interests and economic interests. So first of all, on the security sort of political front, I guess Russia, which looks at the world as being an increasingly multipolar one, where a lot of regional powers are important players and punch above their weight, Turkey is a force to be reckoned with for Russia. Turkey sits in Russia's neighborhood. And so Russia needs to work with Turkey to carefully engage it on a range of bilateral files in order to secure Russian security interests. So that starts with the Black Sea and Ukraine, where Russia understands that Turkey is a player, to Syria, to Libya, to Nagorno-Karabakh. So Russia simply cannot afford not to engage Turkey on those issues if Russia wants to meet its own security interests in those conflicts. And I probably won't go too much into detail on this now, because later in the lecture on Russian interests in the Middle East, I'll actually go a bit deeper into what those Russian interests in Syria and Libya and so on are. But Turkey is in these conflicts. Russia has to deal with Turkey. And separately, I think it is also a Russian interest vis-a-vis Turkey, and perhaps this is where it becomes a bit more controversial or sort of open for debate. But I would argue that in recent years, it's been in the Russian interest to cultivate this relationship with Turkey in order to cultivate a growing Turkish-NATO rift. I don't think that many people in Moscow believe in the possibility that Turkey will ever leave NATO, or that you could, work so much with Turkey, draw Turkey so much on your side that you would be able to provoke a complete rupture between Turkey and NATO. Pragmatic people in Moscow understand that this is not viable. But given the deteriorating relations between Russia and NATO over a whole host of other issues in recent years, to have Turkey within NATO as a sort of difficult ally has been in the Russian interest. And I think Russia has been quite eager to milk that situation to the extent possible. And then finally, there's a whole host of economic interests that Russia has with Turkey. So if we look at the Middle East broadly, I think Turkey is the most important trading partner for Russia, not the Arab states that used to be the historical allies of the Soviet Union, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, with all of those, for reasons that have to do with conflicts in these countries, especially Syria and Iraq. There was not much money to be made for Russia in the last 2 decades, really. Turkey is the most important trading partner for Russia in the region. Of course, Russia sells gas to Turkey. That's hugely important. That also comes to certain Turkish vulnerabilities vis-a-vis Russia that we can talk about. but also military defense cooperation. I mentioned the S-400. Russia is building a nuclear power plant in Turkey, the Akuyu power plant. And then you have tons of Russian tourists going each year to Turkey. I think, you know, when we look at the Middle East, Egypt and Turkey are very important tourist destinations for Russians. And I would not underestimate the importance of those Russian tourists to the Turkish economy. Galip, perhaps you can expand a little bit on this, but I think it's quite significant for the Turkish economy. I'll just give you an anecdote sort of on the importance of the Russian-Turkish economic relationship. So I was living in Moscow in 2015, 2016, as part of the Alpha Fellowship, which is when Russia intervened in the Syrian conflict in September 2015. Shortly after that, you might recall that we had a big crisis in Russian-Turkish relations over the shoot down of a fighter jet. And Putin was very upset, and sweeping economic sanctions were introduced against Turkey, which lasted for a few months because in the summer of 2016, Erdogan relented and apologized, because I think the part of the reason was that the impact of those sanctions on the Turkish economy was so significant. And I remember living on Kutuzovsky Prospect, which is near Kievsky Vokzal in Moscow. And one place I really liked to hang out during this fellowship was a cafe called Turkish Gambit. It was across the street from me. It was a Turkish cafe. You could smoke shisha there and eat like Turkish food. And 2 weeks after this crisis, Turkish Gambit shut down. It literally shut down. So you could even see in Moscow, sort of anecdotally, the real impact of this significant diplomatic crisis. So this is how I would calculate broadly the most important interests that Russia has vis-a-vis Turkey. Now, Galip, I want to ask you, how would you characterize and define Turkish interests vis-a-vis Russia before February 2022? Let's sort of focus on sort of, you know, the period before this latest Ukraine war. Perhaps you could, you know, go through those.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Hanna, for the invitation. I'm pleased to join you and pleased to join the other colleagues. Well, starting with Turkish interest, I think this question is brings another question in mind, because why we discussed the what is so particular that we have discussed the Turkish-Russian relationship in recent years that much? Isn't it just normal for two states to have good bilateral relationship? Isn't it just natural to expect the countries that are basically neighboring each other for maritime neighbors and two major neighbors would be anticipated to trade, to engage in quite wide areas of cooperation or engagement. The question is not about the Turkey and Russia having good bilateral relationship. The reason that we are discussing so much about the changing nature of Turkish-Russian relationship, it is what many describe. The Turkey has engaged in a geopolitical balancing act between Russia and the West. It's not like Russia and Turkey having good bilateral relationship. It's not Turkey and Russia having good trade ties. Turkey and Russia has always had good trade ties. They tried to have good trade ties even during the Soviet Union. Turkey and Russia, Russia or the Soviet Union played major role in the development of some of the heavy industry in Turkey, and these were during the Cold War, where the Turkey was decidedly in NATO. So it's not that Turkey and Russia enjoys the good economic or trade ties or the tourism links that makes us to discuss the Turkish-Russian relationship as much. It is that the Turkey has engaged in a geopolitical balancing act between Russia and the West. It's not even the Turkish search for strategic autonomy that makes this discussion so relevant and so contentious in the West, because the Turkey has been engaged, at least for at least in the last 2 decades, the overarching framework of the current government has been the search for strategic autonomy. But this search for strategic autonomy does not have to have only one color. It does not have to be against the West. It could be in cooperation with the West. It could be in spite of the West, but it could be against the West as well. But it doesn't have to be just against the West. If you look at during the first decade of the current government's rule, the Turkey and the West enjoyed one of the best times. I mean, the Obama in 2000, I think it was in his interview to Atlantic Monthly in 2012, he would count Erdogan among the top three or four world leaders with whom he would have often discuss the geopolitical or global matters. So it's not even the search for strategic autonomy that makes us to have this conversation. It is the geopolitical balancing act. The geopolitical balancing act is the key issue here. The geopolitical balancing act premised on two things that was not previously existed in Turkish-Russian relationship. One of them is engagement in defense industry. The other one is geopolitical engagement, because these two files, the defense industry engagement and the geopolitical engagement between Turkey and Russia, are the novelty in Turkish-Russian relationship. It's not the trades, it's not the tourism, it's not a good neighbor relationship, it's not the technical relationship. So we have to keep in mind the geopolitical balancing act and then defense cooperation. And I would say the defense cooperation came as a result of the geopolitical balancing act. The defense cooperation, we are talking about the S-400 missile system that Turkey bought from Russia, and that generated a significant crisis in Turkish-US or Turkish-Western relationship. That came as a result of the geopolitical engagement, geopolitical cooperation between Turkey and Russia, and that's precisely happened in Syria. The current shape of Turkish-Russian relationship would not have had happened if it was not for the Syrian crisis. So you have to keep in mind the Syrian crisis is the central issue that made the so-called, that gave birth to the so-called the geopolitical balancing act between Russia and the West. And I don't think that Turkey would have bought an S-400 missile system if it was not for the Syrian crisis. Let's not forget the first two military operations that Turkey undertook in Syria was the northwestern Syria, which obviously required the Russian blessings. And that would not, and I think one thing, whether that was like, direct conditionality or not, but the S-400 purchase came after this geopolitical balancing act. The question is why Turkey decided to engage in a geopolitical balancing act with between Russia and the West, and why Turkey decided to cooperate with Russia in Syria in the first place. I think we can have multiple explanations for this. One of them, you can say, well, actually, as Hanna put it, this was an outcome of growing discontent with the West, because in the end, in Syria, the Turkey-US could not agree on a vision. Like, as the crisis in Syria lingered on, the strains in Turkish-US relationship, the Turkish-Western relationship, became more apparent. First, it was over the overthrow or not overthrow of the Assad, because the Obama's not going for the strikes after 2013, when Assad used the chemical weapon, because this was designated as a red line by the Obama administration for military actions, and Turkey wanted this to happen. The Obama not doing so created perception in Ankara that the West or US, particularly the US, is not serious about the regime change. And back then, the Turkish policy was very much regime change centric, and that led to many strains in Turkish-US relationship. After it came the rise of the ISIS, and in rise of ISIS has become another point of contention in Turkish-US relationship. After it came that the US utilized the PYD-YPG, the Syrian Kurds, in the fight against the ISIS, and that created another layer of crisis in Turkish-US relationship. So nevertheless, in Syria, we have a growing crisis in Turkish-US relationship, where the priorities of the both actors were diverging, where the threat perception of the both actors were diverging. The US look at the Turkey's allies, the Turkey's local allies, mainly the Syrian Sunni fighters, through the lenses of radicalism, extremism. The Turkey look at the US local allies, the Syrian Kurds, or the PYD-YPG more specifically, through the lenses of terrorism. So this is the context through which we came. And the 2015, as again Anna put it, Russia was there. So the Russia was the actor on the ground in northwestern Syria, the areas that Turkey wanted to have the military operation. So the first one, the reason that the US, that the Turkey and Russia engaged the level of cooperation that they engaged in, because there was a growing discontent in Turkish-US relationship. The secondly is this was the product of political realism, because it was the Russian that was on the ground. It was the Russian that mattered in the northwestern Syria. So if you want to be more present on northwestern Syria, you have to make a deal in one way or another with Russia. And this is precisely what Turkey did. That after the Turkey shot down the Russian military jet in November 2015, Turkey was effectively pushed outside of the picture from the northwestern Syria. It could not, because the Russia threatened with the military actions. So the Turkey was basically felt that it was becoming a bystander to the rapidly changing geopolitical picture in North Syria, but more specifically northwestern Syria, where the prospect of the Kurds creating territorial contiguity between their different zones of controls, both in the northeast and northwest, becomes a real prospect and a real concern in Ankara. And that led a change of the policy course in Ankara to engage Russia so that they can prevent this creation of the territorial contiguity between the Kurdish actors in Syria. So the second one, as I said, like, you know, one can say it, this was the result of political realism. So there is nothing particular in this scenario in Turkey and Russia engaging in such a geopolitical cooperation, because it was the Russian that was on the ground in Syria, and it was the Russian that mattered. And at this stage, the West basically did not really matter on northwestern Syria part of the story. The third one can say, like, you know, well, there was also this geopolitical discontent with the West. The political realism side also start to have some form of an ideological root as well. When you say the ideology in Turkish-Russian relationship, because for a long time, the question of ideology in foreign policy in Turkey was discussed with a reference to Islamism. But in Turkish-Russian relationship, the question of ideology is discussed in reference to Eurasianism. The Eurasianism, this is like more nationalist Eurasianist posturing. The Eurasianism in Turkey did not have one picture. The idea, the concept of Eurasianism in Turkey has evolved over time. Like the first period when you heard of the Eurasianism, it was like after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Back then, Eurasianism actually meant Turkey having a more significant role in the newly independent Turkic world, or the post-Soviet space of the Central Asia, South Caucasus, etc. The Eurasianism of back then was more geopolitical, not ideological, and it was actually premised on cooperation with the West, and it was decidedly anti-Russia, but to some extent it was anti-Iran and anti-China as well, because back then the idea was that Turkey should play a larger role in the newly independent Turkic world of the post-Soviet space. But today's Eurasianism, I would call it like more ideological, not geopolitical. The major motivating force of today's Eurasianism is anti-Westernism, and it is premised on cooperation. It is premised on the idea of the cooperation with Russia, and it is premised on the idea of anti-Westernism. So today's Eurasianism more ideological than geopolitical. So the role of Eurasianism, we can say, like, you know, to some extent played a role, but not really. So I wouldn't, the role of ideology in Turkish-Russia relationship should not be exaggerated. I think it's overplayed and it's overblown by many actors. It is more the anti-Westernism that plays the role. Another factor is actually, we can discuss the role of Erdogan and Putin, because in the end, this relationship, to what extent this is an Erdogan-Putin relationship, to what extent it is a Turkey-Russia relationship, it's not clear. At this stage, it doesn't matter, because this is the two actors that makes the ultimate decisions in their countries. But if you project the future of this relationship, I would say it matters because whether this relationship will sustain in its current form will means also whether this relationship has an institutional basis. Now, at this stage, this relationship doesn't have very developed institutional basis, but it has like, you know, the pocket of support in different Turkish institutions. So therefore, it does have some support, but it's not as much institutionalized as, let's say, Turkish-Western relationship. And finally, I would say this relationship, to what extent, also came in a very particular geopolitical global context. It was the time when the Putin was, it was the time when the Trump was in US. It was like the post-Brexit era where the internal Western cohesion seems to be more and more questions. And also, if you are in Ankara, you look at the world, you see actually it's not only you, many European countries adopted a very different approach to Russia. From Turkish perspective, there isn't actually much difference between Turkey buying S-400 from Russia and the Germany is pursuing Nord Stream 2 from Russia. Both of them are major geopolitical or security endeavors. You have the French president calling to look at Russia more of as a partner than as a competitor when it comes to European security, calling that the Cold War has ended, so we should not look at Russia through the prism of the Cold War. So, and when Turkey looks at its region in Middle East, it is a region in which the Western footprint is decreasing, the US footprint is decreasing, whereas countries like Russia is increasing its footprint in the regional security, and countries like China is increasing its footprint in the region economy. So from the Turkish perspective, to some extent, this engagement, geopolitical balancing act between Russia and the West is not a very abnormal. What seems to be abnormal in the West, from Turkish perspective, seems to be the new normal. Turkey adapting to the new normal, to adapting to a new international environment in which you have a different centers of powers, and the West is one of them. It is very important for Turkey, but nevertheless, it's one center of power, another one. And for Turkish interest, engaging in a geopolitical balancing act between different centers of power could deliver Turkish interest much more effectively. So I can leave it here.
Thank you, Gala. There's a lot there, and I'll come back to the geopolitical balancing act in a bit. But first, I just want to come in with sort of perhaps the Russian view on the extent to which this relationship is maintained, sustained by the Putin-Erdogan dynamic versus sort of broader institutional ties. It's a question that I posed to Russian academics and sort of experts over the last few years, and I've not found that there is one view or that there's consensus on this question. And there's actually, depending on who you speak with, I think on the Russian side, considerable distrust towards Turkey, like there's distrust among Russians vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, there's also no love lost in that relationship, or distrust towards sort of Arab interlocutors. So Russia's relations with Turkey or with others in the Middle East are not necessarily sustained by a notion of trust. But at the same time, they would point to this convergence in interests on these different issues, and Syria being one of them. At the same time, some would also point to the growing institutionalization of the relationship over time, saying that now we have these routinized 2+2 engagement, that Lavrov and Shoigu, the defense and the foreign and defense minister, interacting very frequently with their Turkish counterparts. And then they meet and they have 5, 6, 7 issues to discuss. And these interactions have become very frequent and hence institutionalized. Also in the Astana format, which includes Iran, of course, regarding Syria. So there appears to be something changing. And some Russians would suggest to you that over time, through this institutionalization, and I haven't even begun to talk about businessmen who might be interacting on both sides and religious communities, these things matter over time. But I did want to ask you on this, on the kind of regional level and Muslim community level, I believe in the 1990s, so after the end of the Cold War, and during the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't have such a significant relationship with Turkey because Turkey was firmly perceived as being part of the NATO bloc. In the 1990s, I think there was considerable concern in Moscow that Turkey might use its leverage over Turkic-speaking communities, Muslim communities in the new Russian Federation to stir up problems, whether in Tatarstan or elsewhere. I think it would be my perception that that concern has somewhat subsided over recent years in Moscow. I mean, I was last in Kazan in October, actually, last year, attending a conference on Russia and the Muslim world. They routinely hold these conferences in Kazan, in Tatarstan, and asking people there about this. And they sort of dismiss now the possibility that Turkey might be causing problems, inside Russia as a means of leverage. What's your view on this issue?
I mean, you are absolutely right when you said this is not a trust-based relationship. And I will go even a step further. This is a mistrust-based relationship, but that is premised on verification and predictability, and involves a constant give and takes, and involves a constant intervention at the top level to sustain or manage or overcome the myriad of crises in the relationship. Because what you see, each time there's a crisis, you have a leadership level summit that eventually solves it. When it comes to the Turkish influence with the Muslim population or the Turkic population of Russia, I think you are right on this point. There was much more enthusiasm after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Turkey will emerge as one of the primary actors amongst the Muslim community or the Turkic community in the post-Soviet space. But this did not materialize as much as people in Turkey anticipated or hoped for. Russia once again inserted itself into the security architecture or order of the post-Soviet spaces, or in one way or another. Once again asserted its primacy in many of these geographic space. In recent years, once again, you have like this more talk of the Turkic world, the idea of the Turkic world gaining a bit more currency in Turkish foreign policies. You see the institutionalization of the Turkic Council, etc., and all these things are very much disliked by Russia, because what Turkey calls the Turkic world, for Russia, this is like its backyard. It's the sphere of influence, or it looks at it through the prism of the national security. I would say. Therefore, like the idea of the Turkic world would always put Turkey and Russia on a collision course, and that's why I wouldn't. That's why I would be always skeptical of this so-called talk of alliance between Turkey and Russia, because almost all the geographies in which Turkey wants to project powers are the geographies that Russia regards as its backyard. The post-Soviet space is the most important one. So I think going forward, once again, we'll be hearing more and more the discourse of the Turkic world coming from Turkey. But thus far, the discourse hasn't turned into reality. And if you look at the developments in Kazakhstan, what has happened in Kazakhstan was a very important statement of the discourse versus the reality. In the end, it was the Russians after these uprisings or the protests. It was the Russians that put its imprint on the suppression of this protests, whereas the Turkey didn't really feature much during this phase, or the Turkic World Council didn't feature much in this. But the Turkish nationalism, now the nationalism is a rising currency in Turkey. So therefore, the idea of Turkic world will be there. But at this stage, I would see this more of an sentimental or discursive of a narrative, a world that is discursively constructed rather than a real geopolitical project.
Thank you, Galay. I want to turn the conversation to the different conflicts in which Russia and Turkey deal with each other and do a little kind of analytical exercise with you. So we talked about Syria and explained why Turkey felt the need to deal with the Russians who were on the ground present, while Turkey could not find a modus vivendi on the Syria issue with the United States. But we don't just have Syria, where Russia and Turkey deal with each other. We also have Libya, and we have Nagorno-Karabakh, especially in light of the October 2020 war. And I guess, first of all, how could we define this engagement? The term I came up with is cooperation, deconfliction, competition nexus, because to my mind, Russia and Turkey cooperate to some extent. They concretely militarily deconflict, especially in Syria, but also in the line of contact in Libya. And then they have the joint monitoring center in Agdam, I guess, as far as it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, though only Russian peacekeepers are deployed. So there's a military dimension, but they also compete because their interests in these conflicts are not actually aligned. So we have this nexus. And if we want to analyze what this cooperation, deconfliction, competition nexus in these conflicts has actually produced, when I was thinking about this question, I came up with a list of a few things. First of all, Russia and Turkey, by engaging with each other, have de facto limited the influence of other third actors in these conflicts, diplomatic and military. You know, the Astana format has basically dominated the Syria agenda for a few years now. In Libya, the Russian-Turkish engagement has also sidelined other diplomatic efforts. And I suppose we could say the same thing about Nagorno-Karabakh, though the EU still tries to play a role here. But so push other actors away and just deal with each other. They have effectively allowed each other to establish and entrench their respective military presence in these conflicts. I guess both Russia and Turkey accept that the other is present in these countries and they don't try to push each other out. They've thereby effectively established anti-access area denial bubbles over parts of these conflicts, sort of limiting the room to maneuver for NATO. And the last thing I would say is that they've effectively established what you could call a military control model in these conflicts, where these conflicts are essentially frozen, but the two sides do not necessarily engage in serious efforts at what we would call conflict resolution. Right now, I think Russia and Turkey can live with the status quo in Syria, as well as in Libya. It's preferable to, you know, serious negotiations in which they might lose their influence and their presence. I mean, in Libya, for example, seriously pursuing security sector reform and negotiations under the auspices of the UN, Russia and Turkish forces would be asked to leave the country. I mean, in fact, they have been asked to leave the country many, many, many times. Russia, of course, only has a covert presence in Libya. It denies being officially on the ground, but nonetheless. So we don't really move towards conflict resolution in these conflicts. Would you agree with that analysis? Would you add anything to what I just said? And then the last question I'll ask you is, because Russia and Turkey are dealing with each other in these different conflicts, they also have the means to hurt each other. They have leverage over each other. And we've seen that play out in the past. I mean, what was it in the spring of 2020 that a lot of Turkish soldiers were killed in Idlib by Russian or regime forces? I guess there's some sort of controversy over this. Turkey is extremely vulnerable to the Russians in Syria, because the moment Russia encourages the Syrian government to launch an offensive on the Idlib province in the northwest of the country, you have another refugee crisis across the Turkish border. So experts routinely say that the Russian leverage over Turkey is greatest in Syria, whereas perhaps Turkey has more leverage over Russia when it comes to Ukraine or the Black Sea, because Turkey can provide Bayraktar drones. So where do you see the leverage? How do you see these relationships in these different conflicts?
I think your description is accurate. I mean, this leverage question is also accompanied by the question of symmetry or asymmetry in this relationship, whether this relationship is symmetric or symmetric, whether how the nature of dependency or interdependency in this relationship is changing. First thing that we have to bear in mind, this is not a static picture of the relationship. So the question of leverage, the question of symmetry or asymmetry, the question of dependency, interdependency in Turkish-Russian relationship is not a static one. It's a dynamic one. It changes by each passing crisis or issues, etc. So perhaps, like, the Turkey, when the only crisis in their bilateral relationship was Syria, the Turkey was more dependent on Russia. There was, let's say, more asymmetry in the relationship. But when the number of crises in the relationship has increased and expanded, including Libya, including Nagorno-Karabakh, now the Black Sea security, this question of dependency has changed. This question of asymmetry has changed. So on one context, Turkey is more dependent. On other contexts, Russia is more vulnerable, etc. So this question is dynamically changing. Secondly, I think you rightly pointed out, their engagement has been more effective in designing the conflict map of this crisis, but not the political map of this crisis, because changing the conflict map, is relatively easier than coming out with a really functioning political solution for this crisis, because this will involve many more local, regional, international stakeholders in this conversation. So they have been, in a sense, I would say they have been more successful in calming down the conflicts, but not like in delivering the political resolution. And to be honest, we don't see any successful political resolution for any of the crises that we're discussing in the Middle East per se as well. So it's in all of them, these are the generational crises. Like, I don't see the Syria or Libya as kind of short-term crisis, or even Nagorno-Karabakh. It has been there for a generation. I mean, it's already been there for a generation. So those are the generational crises, and it cannot be easily resolved by these two countries' bilateral engagements. But one thing that has been very crucial, again, as you pointed out, they increase in their influence came at the expense of someone else's influences. In Syria, it came at the expense of the West. In Libya, also, it came to some extent at the expense of the West. But in Nagorno-Karabakh, that's the difference. I think there is one difference between Turkey and Russia, one difference in Turkey-Russian relationship, how they engage in the post-Soviet space and how they engage in the non-post-Soviet space area. Because Russia is more willing to engage in structured manner with Turkey in Middle East, North Africa, etc., but not willing to engage Turkey in such a structured manner in post-Soviet space, because there it sees the increase in Turkish role would come at its own expense. It will not, like, increase in Turkish role in South Caucasus, which inevitably means, like, decrease in one way or another for Russian or the Iranian influence, because this is not really a Western area of power projection. So the difference is how they engage in post-Soviet space and non-post-Soviet space. If you look at, despite Turkey's repeated quest, Russia was not really willing to engage with Turkey in a structured manner in Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey was not present in the picture when the political deal was delivered between the Armenians and Azerbaijan. It was in Moscow, and it was like Putin there, no other Turkish official there. So Russia was more willing to do a parallel track with Turkey, whereas like in Syria, it was like within the Astana format, Turkey, Russia, Iran, all was there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I feel that I remember speaking to Russians in 2021 in Moscow, just a few weeks or months after the Karabakh War. And there was almost a little bit of a state of shock at how forcefully Turkey had inserted itself. People were saying, basically for the first time since the end of the Cold War, into a conflict really in what Russia considers its privileged sphere of influence, and that Turkey had also potentially gained a new card to play against Russia, because there was a perception at the time. I don't know how much it was borne out by evidence, because I didn't follow and study the issue, But there was a lot of talk at the time that Turkey could create a nexus between the Middle East and Nagorno-Karabakh, potentially channeling Syrian foreign fighters or others to fight on the side of Azerbaijan in this conflict. And I think this was a cause of concern in Moscow. It was definitely something that was frequently mentioned, sort of Turkey developing a new card over Russia in its own neighborhood. I do have sort of two topics left that I briefly want to touch upon with you before we should open it up for some question. If we talk about vulnerabilities and leverages in the relationship, let's briefly touch upon energy, Galip. The Turks buy a lot of gas from Russia. They have in recent years. They've been trying to decrease those vulnerabilities. You've written about this issue, diversifying gas imports, buying more from Azerbaijan, exploration in the Eastern Med and the Black Sea. But I looked at the numbers for 2021, and though Turkey had been decreasing its dependence on Russia in the previous years, actually that trend was reversed in 2021, I think because of high LNG prices. And I also think since February 2022, we haven't seen any talk about Turkey cutting back its gas imports from Russia. And Russia also hasn't mentioned kind of cutting back supplies to Turkey. So there's the gas issue. And then we have Akuyu, Rosatom building the first nuclear power plant in Turkey, which I understand, is important for the leadership in Turkey. It sees it as indicative of its sort of future technological advancement as a way to also support the energy diversification. And some Western observers are concerned that once these power plants are actually built, and I think some units are scheduled to be completed by 2023, Russia will actually be responsible for the operation and the safety of this power plant in Turkey, giving yet more leverage to Russia over Turkey. How do you see this whole energy vulnerability relationship, especially, and this is my last sentence, at a time when the Turkish economy is really struggling with inflation and the economy is the big issue that Erdogan has to worry about ahead of the elections?
No, I think you are very right. The energy is actually the biggest, perhaps like one of the biggest unmitigated vulnerability of Turkey vis-a-vis Russia, because this bringing more energy from the friendly countries didn't turn out as much as Turkey wanted. The LNG, the previous desire to go more for LNG options also proved to be more expensive. So it wasn't. It's not proving to be a solution. So that's, I think, a major question that Turkey will grapple with down the road. The Turkey is not joining, as you put it. Turkey is not joining the sanctions on Russia. The Turkey is not joining the sanction on Russian energy, and Turkey is not joining on closing its airspace to Russia. It only closed the airspace to Syria. So the airspace is closed for the flights between Russia and Syria. But apart from this, the Turkey is not joining these sanctions. So I think what Turkey will try to do, given this very dependency in these areas, Turkey will try to gain leverage in somewhere else. So therefore, create a bit more asymmetry in relationship. I think the more Russia squeezes in Black Sea, the good news, this is the better for Turkey, because we should never forget, despite all this talk of love affairs in Turkish-Russian relationship, Russia is the country with which Turkey has the most number of wars during the Ottoman period, and this legacy does inform the historical consciousness of not only the Ottoman elite but the Turkish elite as well. Both the Ottoman and Turkish elite. If there was if there is one political continuity or foreign policy continuity from the Ottoman time to the Turkish Republic, I would say the consciousness about the Russian geopolitical aspirations. Or Russian geopolitical revisionism. So the Ottoman and Russian fought 13 wars, and the center of gravity of these wars were Black Sea. So therefore, if Russia could have had an easy victory in Black Sea, that would have meant a major trouble for Turkey. because Turkey is a major Black Sea power as well. So if Russia could cut off Ukraine from Black Sea, or if Russia could dominate Black Sea more, that would have been a major trouble for Turkey. And actually, in this scenario, the Turkey would have had another, would have faced another trouble. We would have many countries becoming, new Belarus for Russia. Like, for instance, if Russia could have an easy victory in Ukraine, I don't think that Armenia would have had any chance but to turn into another Belarus. I don't think that many other states in the post-Soviet space would have had any chance but to turn into another Belarus. And these are all the places that Turkey tried to project power as well to. It's Turkey's immediate neighborhood. So Turkey will try to gain more leverage elsewhere, so that it creates more, let's say, symmetry in its balance of vulnerability vis-a-vis Russia.
Galip, you partially answered my last question, but I'll pose it again in any case. I mean, I sort of started our conversation by outlining very much to navigate the Ukraine war since February, sort of playing on both sides, offering itself as a mediator that has served Erdogan very well, also domestically ahead of the elections. So, trying to squeeze concessions out of NATO, sending Bayraktar to Ukraine, not antagonizing Russia too much. All these things are going on at the same time. So let me ask you, if we think about possible futures, trajectories of the Ukraine war going forward, we can take a 6 or 12 months timeline, but we can also think about the next 5 years. I guess we can broadly categorize those scenarios into a protracted war of attrition in Ukraine's east, a scenario in which Russia makes further gains, including perhaps advancing towards the southern coastline and taking Odessa, or at least posing a protracted military threat to Odessa and the southern coastline and access to the Black Sea, effectively turning Ukraine into a landlocked country. And then the alternative scenario of Russia having to retreat and being, having losses in Ukraine and Ukrainian counteroffensive. Perhaps there are variations of these scenarios, but can you just explain briefly what, from a Turkish point of view, is the most and the least desirable scenario in terms of Turkish national interests?
Well, Russia not having dominating Black Sea is a priority. Ukraine not being cut off from Black Sea would be a crucial Turkish national interest. The Russia Russia not having a victory in Ukraine is a major Turkish national interest. The question is how you define the victory. And I think this is a challenge that Turkey faces, but also this is a challenge that I see in the Western discussion on Ukraine, because you see, in a sense, the three different versions of the goals that you are hearing. One of them is the strategic defeat of Russia. I don't know exactly what this means when different actor uses it. The taking the Russia's great power status from it. This, I would say, perhaps is more dominant in Anglo-Saxon, the British or the American conversation than in continental Europe one. And also basically making sure that Russia doesn't have a victory, but Russia also is not humiliated at the same time. This is now and then you hear this different version of it in French or the German debate as well. So in Turkey's context, I would say for Turkey, for sure, Russia not having a victory in Ukraine. For sure, Russia not cutting off Ukraine from Black Sea. For sure, Russia not dominating the Black Sea. But I think the Turkish elite might also worried a failed Russia, like in a sense, a severely weakened Russia might be as much part of a problem as well. So, but the question is, how can you balance these kind of things? In Ukraine, I call the Turkish position in this process, I call the Turkish position as being pro-Ukraine without necessarily being too much anti-Russia. And even though I said so, but how do you operationalize it in real terms? Thus far, you see the Turkey operationalizing it on the one hand, actually providing Ukraine with the military support. So Turkey was actually one of the countries that provided military support to Ukraine early on. I mean, sold it early on, the Turkey, US, UK, etc. Whereas, like, many, if you put aside countries like Poland, many European countries were refraining from doing so. but it is also a country that rejects to join the sanction, that rejects to join the the other sanction regimes against Russia. One of them is because the number of vulnerabilities that Turkey has vis-a-vis Russia is significant. And one of the difference that Turkey has when you compare to many European or Baltic or Eastern European countries, the Turkey faces Russia in geographic context that is not covered by the NATO security commitments or guarantees. For instance, if Russia kills two Polish soldiers, it would not be only killing two Polish soldiers, it would be killing two NATO soldiers. The response would not be anticipated solely coming from Poland, it would be anticipated to come from NATO, because Poland is a NATO member country. But when Russia killed 36 Turkish soldiers in Syria, it killed 36 Turkish soldiers in Syria in 2020, because it was not covered by the NATO security committee. So the Turkey has to have some, like many consideration that European member of NATO doesn't have it as well, meaning that facing Russia in geographic context that is not covered by them. That's why I think that from Turkish perspective, it's making sure that Russia doesn't have a victory, but at the same time not antagonizing Russia, that Russia would want to extract a cause from Turkey as well.
Thank you very much for that, Galip.